looks like I need to fix the printer since it doesn't seem to even want to turn on. Since I'm getting no power at all in the display and it's not making any sounds, it tells me that there's something going on with the power supply. Got 3 along the bottom, 2 here, 3 along there, so it looks like it's 8. And I'm doing this on top of a container that I don't have to worry about losing screws down in the carpet or cracks on the floor. Once we have those 8 bolts off, the bottom panel is loose at that point, but we can't get it off without also removing this cross piece. Okay, so once we remove this one side, we just have to remove both sides of this cross piece. So this is a Anycubic i3 Mega. Came out a number of years ago, but it's been working pretty good so far, but eventually parts wear out and you gotta replace them. So by getting this out a little bit, we can now get the bottom plate out of the way and we can get at the power supply. Now that I've taken the back panel off and loosened up this wire support here, flipped it around a bit so that we can see the electrical contacts, because that's where the problem seems to be. Since I'm not seeing any power at all, I'm just going to try turn it off, plug it in the power. Okay, so now I'm going to take my multimeter and put it at 200 volts AC. So this is in theory on. It's 200 volts AC. In here we have load, neutral, ground. They're brown, blue, yellow, which is not familiar to anybody in North America, but it is more of a European and Chinese standard. So if we go across load and neutral, or load and ground, we should get 120 volts, and we have nothing. And if we do the same thing across the plug, we're getting 118 volts, which is about right. So something between the plug and the power supply is broken. The power isn't even getting to the power supply, so then the next thing to do would be to pop out the fuse. There's a small fuse here. Popping out that, we can see a very black fuse. That tells me something went wrong with the power supply, blew the fuse. Blowing the fuse saves the wiring in the rest of the house, stops it from bursting into flames. I did already try putting in a new fuse, and it wasn't just the fuse going once. There's something seriously wrong with the power supply. So rather than just changing the fuse, we're going to change out the entire power supply just to be safe. So the power supply is held in by 4 bolts from the top. But before we remove those, we need to, it's always good, take a picture of how it's wired up so that everything gets back to where it should be. When we're done, we should have the same red, red, empty space, black, black, yellow, blue, brown. Looking at the replacement power supply, it's also labeled the same, where we have 3 positive 12 volt, 3 negative 12 volt, and then ground, neutral, and load. Okay, so flipping it back around, on the top, right above the power supply are 4 bolts. Removing those will allow us to pop out the power supply. And these are slightly longer than all the other ones, so make sure to keep these separate. So we won't be able to put back the same screws, even though they're the same size bolt head. Now the screws are out, power supply could come out, and now we're ready to put in the replacement power supply. And it was important to note that we want to make sure that the power supply goes back in the same orientation. So when it was in there before, the wires were coming out towards the power connectors. If you put it in backwards, there won't really be any way to run these wires back. So it's important to make sure that it gets back in the same orientation. And one other thing that's important to switch before you put it in, this is it doesn't automatically switch between 110 and 220. It will work with both. But since we're in North America, I've come in here, push this over to the 110 side, so that it won't work. Depending on how well it's built, setting it at 220 and plugging it into 110, you'll just get, all the voltage will be too low. It's a bigger problem if you have it set at 110 and you plug it into someplace that actually has 220 wall outlets. So fairly slightly lower risk in North America. So having a bit of a trouble trying to line up these holes with those holes, so I'm going to draw some guidelines. So as I'm getting near the holes, hopefully I'll see the line and it'll tell me which direction to steer. So after wiggling the power supply along until I saw the lines that I drew, then I was able to steer it in place and drop in the screws and tighten them up. And you want these to be, you don't want to torque down on them as hard as you can. You just want them to be finger tight so they don't fall out, but you don't want to, they're fairly small screws, so you don't want to pull on them so hard that they break. So now we can flip it back around, and we now have access to where the DC output is and the AC input. And if we go back to how this was originally wired, where we had brown, blue, yellow, we can get the wires back in. Okay, so now that we've gotten the power supply AC, the high voltage, screwed into the power supply with brown, blue, yellow. In North America, this would be black, white, green, or sometimes red, white, green. Every area has a little bit different for wiring standards. So now that the power supply is in, we can put a fresh fuse in. In this case, it's a 250 volt 5 amp fuse for the Anycubic i3 Mega. And turn the power off just to be safe, put the fuse back in, And I'm leaving the DC disconnected for now until we can verify that this new power supply is working. So now turn it off, reconnect the power, and hopefully, okay, I'm hearing a hum from the power supply fan. I'm not seeing any smoke anywhere. None of the little blue pixie fairies are coming out of the fuse. So now is a great time to check whether or not we're getting power from the cord through the fuse and to the power supply. So setting the multimeter at 200 volts AC for the range and checking between load and neutral. We have 118 volts. Between load and ground, we have 118 volts. Between neutral and ground, we have 0 volts. Those are all the combinations. You should only you should definitely be getting power if the device is properly grounded between the load and the neutral and the load and the ground, and there shouldn't be any power at all between the neutral and the ground. So now that that's installed, we can switch the multimeter over to 20 volts DC. You don't want to run the, you want to, if you don't have an automatically switching multimeter, it's important to switch at this point. And also, if you're not knowledgeable and comfortable with high voltage, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be touching it, because this is high voltage. It is dangerous. So now I can test between red for positive on the red side and on the negative, and I'm seeing 12.1 volts, which is pretty good for a power supply. If it was 13 or 14 volts for whatever reason, there is a small potentiometer here on the power supply where you can actually adjust the voltage. I'm not going to adjust it from 12.1. Certainly as the input high voltage fluctuates between 115 or 125 volts, the AC will fluctuate between 11.5 and 12.5, and that's okay. Electronics has to be designed to be able to handle that. The rest of it will take that 12 volts and it will convert it back to 5 volts or 3.5 volts whenever it needs it. So next step is going to be to turn it off, disconnect the power, and we will be letting this settle down and making sure that there's still no remaining residual power in the power supply. Sometimes capacitors can hold a charge for a bit, so it's important to make sure there's no remaining power. Here I'm only seeing, less than a volt. It's seeing something, but now it's safe to handle. So now we should be ready to hook up the positive and negative 12 volts into the printer. Okay, so now that we've attached the black DC wires or black negative wires and red positive wires, we can snap the plastic shield in place. That helps you to accidentally, poke a finger in there and touch the high voltage lines. So before reattaching the bottom plate and this wire stiffener, we're gonna flip it over and see if it turns on. So now, having it turned off, always turn it off before putting the cord in. And that's the happy chirp of an Anycubic i3 Mega booting up. So at this point, I'm going to turn it off and replace all of the screws from the bottom plate, and the printer should be functional.